Welcome back to our masterclass, Negotiate Winning Partnerships in China Without Speaking Chinese. Today is lesson 2 of your Foundations for Negotiations. Today we're going to talk about the Chinese negotiations process. So when you go to China and you start to meet potential partners, the first thing you really need to think about is, what is my purpose for negotiating? Okay, so for most Americans or for most Westerners, the purpose of negotiations is to sign a contract, to reach an agreement. Now, there's many reasons why most people feel that it's important to negotiate and get a contract, because the contract provides legal protection if partners don't live up to their obligations. But it also provides a blueprint for the way forward. It's basically a document that says, this is how we're going to work together. Okay, so this is pretty standard. For most Chinese people, the purpose of negotiating is actually to develop mutual trust. And this is a mutual trust that's based on a system of goodwill and reciprocity. And for most Chinese people, the negotiations doesn't really end when the contract is signed. So the question that we really have to think about is, how do we align when we start at fundamentally opposing objectives, right? One side is trying to sign a contract, and the other side is just trying to develop guanxi. So it really requires for us to make a mindset adjustment. And from my observation, it really comes down to, if you care more about the specifics of the contract or the agreement, my experience has been this is really capping your maximum ROI. And what do I mean by that? It means that after the contract is signed, after you think you've gotten all the concessions that you wanted, what you end up doing, especially for those who are doing business in China, and there's kind of this lack of trust or skepticism to begin with, is you start to enforce the terms of the contract. You start monitoring and making sure that your partners are living up to their obligations, as opposed to collaborating and trying to develop a win-win. And this is very nuanced, but this is kind of a mindset adjustment that you really need to start to make. Because when we look at the Chinese mindset for negotiations, when we start the negotiation process, when you meet somebody for the very first time and you're talking about working together, that period up until the contract is signed is pretty similar. Okay, so you're exchanging information, you're getting to know each other, and you're trying to set expectations on how this partnership may or may not work. And of course, you want to develop good relationships with people that you want to trust with your product or your service or your IP. And that period up until the contract is signed is pretty much standard, and I would say there's not a lot of deviation when you're meeting people for the first time and you're trying to develop and exchange that goodwill. And for most Westerners, after the contract is signed, the quote-unquote negotiations actually ends. Okay, so now that the contract is signed, now we can start doing what we're set out to do. The problem is for most Chinese people, the negotiations actually begins after the contract is signed. Okay, it doesn't begin in a literal sense, but it's important to understand that it begins in a figurative sense, because for most Chinese people, signing the contract only means that we have decided to work together. And for most Westerners, this is when the work really begins. But for Chinese people, this is when guanxi really begins. And what happens is, most Americans or most foreigners who don't understand this system of reciprocity and goodwill and guanxi in China, after the contract is signed, they get into this mode of kind of monitoring to make sure partners are living up to their obligations. And that is when all of the bad behavior begins. Okay. Now, it doesn't happen obviously immediately, but over a period of months, often years, a lot of foreign companies will complain about behavior from their Chinese partners that they think is bad or unethical or even corrupt. And the problem is this behavior occurs not because Chinese people are unethical or corrupt, but it occurs because you have stopped developing guanxi. Okay? In order to achieve a win-win over the lifetime of your partnership, your exchange of goodwill and reciprocity, your giving and receiving of face, and your development of closer guanxi relationships, it should never end. In fact, it should continue through the life of the partnership, and that is really the only way to create a successful partnership. So the key lesson for this module is really to understand the Chinese negotiation process and to really understand that bad behavior, however you define it, occurs when you stop negotiating. And doing business in China, whether you continue to negotiate or quote unquote develop guanxi relationships, is actually 100% controllable by you. And in the next module, we'll really get into more details about what developing guanxi really is.